Blackfire Exploration is a small private Canadian company based in Calgary that has been active in southern Mexico in the state of Chiapas for several years. A couple of years ago they actually started mining barite, and they've got a bunch of properties there. And they ran into a lot of community opposition. Initially because they'd made a bunch of promises that they weren't going to keep about the kind of benefits that were going to flow to the local community, but then the people started realizing, hey, these guys are mining outside their own property, they're mining on other people's property, they're polluting the water, they're disrupting the village, and they started protesting. And this all came to a head last year when the community had blockaded the mine. They blocked the road to the mine, and the leader of the protest was actually arrested on trumped-up charges that were eventually dropped. And then a few months later, last November, he was actually shot and killed. 3 company employees or former employees were charged with the murder. We're still waiting to see how that happens. But in the meantime, the operation was then shut down by the Mexican authorities for environmental disturbances, for polluting the streams and so on. And what we then discovered was that the company had also complained to the state legislature that they were being extorted by the local mayor. They were making payments to the mayor. It turned out they'd been making payments for over a year before it occurred to them to complain about it. And our interpretation of that was that they had an arrangement and it was no longer satisfactory to the company. So what we did, and because the company had actually, the company complained that they were being extorted by the mayor, but they've been paying him all along. So they'd actually provided this documentation to the state Congress as part of their complaint, and so we looked at this and said, holy cow, we've got bank statements and check receipts here for bribery. However you look at it, they've been making payments to this mayor for services rendered somehow, and we put that together and just this week submitted that to the RCMP as a formal request to say, look, here's the documentation. We hear all the time about corruption and local authorities are paid off and so on. We never see the paperwork. Nobody's ever got documentation of it. It's the hardest thing to prove. And here we have the actual material from the company acknowledging this is what's been going on. So we submitted that to the RCMP in the hopes that they would be able to find enough there to prosecute under the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act.
Was there any comment from the RCMP when you submitted this to them?
No, they don't comment publicly on things like this. They will do whatever investigation they do, and then if charges are laid, then there will be an announcement. That's all we know.
What is it?
Well, I think it tells us what we already knew in a sense, that they were really trying to push this project through and make some money without the consent of the community.
How unusual is this case?
Well, on one level, as I say, it's extremely unusual to have this kind of documentation to actually say, look, here's a possible bribery case, and we actually have a law that deals with that, and here you go. On the other hand, as I say, it's also very common that there is corruption. It's very common that mining companies will look for local authorities or anyone really that they can work with. In some cases, they'll set up their own organization and sign people up so that they'll have somebody to work with, and then they can go to their shareholders and say, oh yes, we have local partners that we're working with. They set up their own foundations. They often bypass the existing local authorities or the community organizations because they might be difficult to get along with. They might have to alter their plans, or they might have to respect the community's wishes if the community doesn't actually want to mine.
Are there other instances around the world of Canadian mining companies being potentially involved in murders of protesters?
Unfortunately, there are. There are cases of mine company security being directly involved, and there are also cases of, sort of, as in this case, company employees, former employees, private security that's hired by the mine being involved, and there have been There have been a number of people killed just in the last year in Central America, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and also in Mexico, linked to the company operations. In some cases, the accused, because we haven't actually had a conviction in any of these cases yet, except for one of the ones in El Salvador. In many cases, the accused is linked to the company somehow, but the company's able to sort of say, well, we didn't know what they were doing, or in the case of Blackfire, what our employees do on their own time is up to them. And frankly, I think, if it's a matter of drinking or, partying in the evening, that's one thing. I think shooting people is something else as far as what your employees do on their own time. And in fact, what's happened is in the cases where there have been successful prosecutions, like in El Salvador, the crime has been pinned on local gang members. These are the guys that actually kidnapped and tortured Marcelo Rivera in El Salvador. But they also said, yes, we were paid a lot of money by other people to do this job. It wasn't their idea. And what we haven't seen is an investigation that actually gets to the bottom of who's actually behind this. I think it would certainly make a difference. It wouldn't necessarily affect specific cases like the Blackfire one, because in this case it's a private company, and the mechanism that this Bill C-300 proposes is essentially one to govern Canadian government involvement. So if the government isn't involved either through investment or political support, then it wouldn't really make any difference. So, but in the other cases it certainly would. The Canadian pension plan is invested in a lot of mining companies, especially the bigger ones. And the Canadian government, the Canadian embassies in these countries has been quite involved in promoting and supporting specific mining projects, not just the policies that facilitate Canadian investment, but the specific mining projects. So essentially it's a government accountability bill as much as it is a corporate accountability bill. What it does is say there are standards that are set up by agencies like the World Bank, and we would expect Canadian mining companies to respect those standards, and we will actually work towards improving them and filling in the gaps, because there are a lot of gaps in those guidelines. And if a company is investigated and found to be in violation of human rights standards or environmental protection standards or labor standards, then they would lose government support.
What do you think Canadians who are concerned about this issue, about Blackfire, or about the broader issue might do to get involved?
Well, in terms of the broader issue, I think there's a lot of information about these cases. There's a lot of misinformation. I think the companies themselves benefit from being able to make stories up, and then they can continue working while we have to try and find out what the truth of the matter is, or responsible journalists have to find out what the truth of the matter is. The mainstream media will just report whatever the mining companies say. But people can inform themselves, and they can talk to their MPs and local representatives about what's going on. And that will support Bill C-300. There are also other private members' bills. There also needs to be a lot of pressure on the government to respond to this. As I say, a lot of these projects enjoy significant support from the Canadian embassy, from in whatever country. We have the Prime Minister visiting Barrick Gold in whatever country he happens to be in. Whether it's Chile or Tanzania, all of a sudden there's the Canadian representatives are visiting this company and making it quite clear that the company enjoys full government support. So the government needs to know that the public is aware of some of these flaws, shall we say, and expects more responsibility on the part of the company, but also on the part of the Canadian government. And then specifically, I think in cases like this, there are urgent actions that people will be writing to not just the Canadian embassy, but also the Mexican authorities to say, look, we're aware of what's going on. We expect a proper investigation. We expect you to find out not just who pulled the trigger, but who ordered the hit. It's not acceptable for community leaders engaged in nonviolent protest to be shot and killed.